So we're going to talk about basically building Spring applications that integrate, and it's called social integration, but as we speak in a minute, it's not necessarily social. Don't get hung up on that word, and I'll speak to why in a minute. But basically, Spring Developer's Guide to social integration, building applications that integrate with APIs outside of themselves. I'm going to make some statements later in this talk, and because of that, they've asked me to put this so-called safe harbor statement in there to kind of tell you that I might make statements about things that are in progress. I mean, I'm no lawyer, but basically it says don't hold me to any of those things. They're just things that I would like to do, but I can't promise you they're going to happen. I'm no lawyer, so I've tried to kind of dumb this down for myself, and hopefully it'll help you guys out as well understand what this means. And so I put in the John Lennon statement. So this just basically means, you know, I'm making plans, but life might change those. So bear with me when I start making forward thinking plans or statements about what I might or might not do. All right. So what's in a tweet? I put together a handful of tweets that I've picked up over just the last several days just to kind of talk about, you know, the kinds of things you might pull from a social network. Now again, I want to stress that this is not necessarily about social, but if you were working with social networks like Facebook or Twitter or what have you, there's a lot of things you can learn about your users, and a lot of things you can learn about the people that they are friends with, and a lot of things you can learn about just generally if you start searching Twitter or searching Facebook. And so here's Josh Long. He travels a lot, and apparently he left Tokyo and Shanghai and Oslo, and then he came here. If I was a business that was somehow in any way whatsoever related to the travel industry, and I saw this tweet, I might want to react to that and maybe entice Josh to purchase my products or buy my services, right? If you know, buy my luggage or use my airline or whatever it is you might do if you saw this kind of thing. And so it'd be really cool if I could write an application that would follow or just follow this stream of information that people are freely providing on the internet. It'd be cool if I could write an application that would follow that and somehow figure out what this tweet means and what's trying to be said, and from that react to it. Here's another one. Venkat says a little bit about modularization and what's testable. And again, the same kind of thing. If you were a developer and you wanted to react to certain statements, you might, if you were very clever, the Venkat's is a little bit harder to programmatically discern, but you could maybe figure out what Venkat's trying to say here, and from that react to it and maybe repost it to a friend to a collection of friends who are also developers who might find value into this. Just the same way you do manually, maybe with your phone, you might have an automated system that might kind of do the same kind of thing, if you could somehow learn something about it. And then my colleague Roy apparently wanted a taco emoji, so clearly we need to market tacos to Roy. He wants some tacos. Not just an emoji, but as long as he's mentioning tacos, I imagine he likes eating them. So let's do that. And then here's one of my own. I put this in at the last minute just because this really happened to me. There's a place I like to eat in Texas called Torchys Tacos, and Torchys is outstanding tacos. I'm not doing an advertisement for them or anything. I'm just stating a clear fact. They are outstanding. But I was there the other night, and the service was really slow, and people were telling us it was taking over an hour to get the food, and that's never happened before. And so I just tweeted about it. And so the next day, Torchys responded and said, no, we're going to deal with that. So as a business, if you were able to respond to your customers, I'm sure they don't have a system doing this. I'm sure they have someone sitting around who's in charge of social media, but if there was a way you could somehow understand the fact that I was upset about my weight. I mean, clearly the word tacos were in there, and there was a indication of time, and not only just an indication of time, there was a measure of time that would probably indicate a long wait. That might be something that a system could respond to and say, you know what, I think I understand what that's saying. Well, what I'm going to ask you to do now, before we go any further, is I'm going to invite you to be as much a part of my session demo as you possibly can. So as often as you feel like it, tweet during the session, and be sure and use be sure and use the Spring Social tag for sure, but also at least use S2GX tag or mention at Spring 1.2GX because it's kind of important for the purposes of this demo I'm going to show you later. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we get there. So we hear a lot about microservices this weekend at Spring 1. A lot of people talking about microservices. And generally speaking, when we're talking about microservices, we're talking about building applications that are composed of multiple individual services, and they communicate, these components communicate with each other and coordinate with each other to accomplish some sort of business need. But what we're going to talk about in this session is related but different. It's how do you reach out to some other service outside of your little bubble, your application's bubble of microservices. And how do you reach out to those and either fetch data, alter data, what have you. And it turns out there's, I say there's hundreds. Honestly, I've never counted. I would imagine there's probably thousands of APIs out there on the internet, chock full of information, things you can do with them, things you can read from them, and things you can learn from. And most of these, not all, but most of these are secured with OAuth. And if anybody's ever worked with OAuth, you know that OAuth is a tricky little beast and not necessarily easy to work with. And that's what we're going to have to overcome if we're going to just work with these APIs. It would be nice if we could just call a method or send a GET request and things would just work. But unfortunately, those APIs make it tricky. Well, fortunately for the users of those APIs, they're secure, but that security therefore makes it trickier to work with. And so this is a summary of what OAuth is, if any of you have never seen it before. It is an authorization protocol, not authentication, authorization, although there are means by which you can use it to authenticate a user. Essentially what it is your application needs access, needs to read or write data to some other user's data on some other API. So you have something like Facebook, let's say, or Twitter, and you would like to read their tweets or you'd like to post a tweet on their behalf, and you need their permission to do that. It would be really nice if Twitter just didn't let people post for them without their permission. I mean, it's good if they lock that down. So you need to get the permission to do that, and the way you get the permission is using OAuth, this thing called the OAuth Dance. And what it generally involves is a redirect from your application to the API involved to an authorization page where the user, assuming they're logged in, and if not, they will be logged in. If they're logged into Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, they can say, yes, I will allow this application to access this information on my behalf. And the problem with OAuth, though, is it comes in so many flavors. There's OAuth 1 and OAuth 1.0a, which were subtly different from each other. 1.0a fixed a small security hole in 1.0, but unfortunately, believe it or not, there are still APIs out there that are still using OAuth 1. And then there's OAuth 2, which has its own multiple flavors. There's the most common one you run into is authorization grant. And what it essentially amounts to is, it's a lot like OAuth 1. Your application redirects to the provider. The provider asks the user if it's okay that they use your data. You say yes, it redirects back. And when it redirects back, it redirects back with an authorization code. And this code can then be used behind the scenes to exchange with the provider and get a thing called an access token. And this access token represents the permission, the authorization that the user has given you to access and manipulate their data. Implicit grant's kind of like that. It still does the redirect, but instead of getting a code back, you actually get the access token back. It's more useful in scenarios where you don't really want to deal with the overhead of redirecting and then turning around and calling back again. It's useful in scenarios where you can't trust the client to necessarily maintain that token securely long term. It's good primarily for clients. That's where it's mostly useful for. And then there's resource owner credentials grant, also known as password grant. This enables the client to simply ask the user for their username and password and then exchange those credentials for an access token. It's a little different than what they might do if you were using HTTP Basic, where the client would ask the user for their credentials and it would encode those credentials and use them on every single request. This is a little different in that it asks the client for their credentials, exchanges those for a token, and then uses that token on every single request. It's expected to toss away the credentials after it's done. This is actually more appropriate for like high trust scenarios, where like a mobile phone, mobile application, where a redirect would be either awkward or perhaps impossible, and the user actually does trust the client to a high degree and is trusting that they're not going to use their credentials inappropriately. And then there's client credentials grant, which is a lot like password grant. The only difference is instead of exchanging a user's credentials for an access token, you're exchanging a client's credentials, the actual application's credentials, for an access token. And the one thing about that that's kind of important is you're limited in what you get. The token you get can't be used to alter a user's set of data or to even access necessarily a user's set of data. It's very limited to application level type top operations. But regardless of which one of these you use, where do you get this access token back? And you might, in some cases, get a refresh token back. In the case of OAuth 1, you're going to get an access token back, and you're going to get a set of secrets back that go with that. You have these things now. What are you going to do with those? Because you're expected to store them securely. And so if you were to write this yourself, if you were to build this up in an application yourself, you have to not only figure out how to negotiate the OAuth dance, but once you're done, you have to figure out what you're going to do with those credentials, what you're going to do with that token, primarily, that token and those keys, so that they don't fall into the wrong hands. You're going to have to store them securely and figure out a plan for how you're going to deal with that and how you're going to associate that token with a specific user, because that token does belong to that user. If another user authorized, you get yet another token. So you have to save this stuff securely and associate it with the user in question. Well, that's where Spring Social, my project, comes in. And so what Spring Social does is solves all those interesting problems. It handles that OAuth dance, and it knows whether you're dealing with OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. It knows which one you're dealing with, because the way it knows is which provider are you dealing with. If you're dealing with Twitter, you're dealing with OAuth 1.0a. If you're dealing with Facebook, you're dealing with OAuth 2, or at least Facebook's variant of OAuth 2. If you're dealing with LinkedIn, you have the choice between the two, but Spring Social implements the OAuth 2 option. So it just knows that if you're dealing with this particular provider, this particular API, this is the kind of OAuth dance you need to work with. Thing is, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to go write a controller to do this redirect nonsense. You don't have to write anything to fetch that token under the covers. Spring Social is going to handle that for you. And it does know how, once you have this token, it knows how to store it. We have something called what's it called now? A connection repository. And so a connection in Spring Social terms is a representation of that authorization. It's not just the token, but it's anything that goes with the token that identifies this as the authorization that the user has given you. And we store that, and we store it securely. Our current implementations out of the box is we have an in-memory one, which is not very useful except for development purposes. We also have one that hits a relational database using JDBC. There are some community contributions that do things like Mongo and Neo4j, so if you want to store those there. It actually comes down to a very simple interface you have to implement, and you can create your own. It does provide several out-of-the-box bindings, API bindings, where a binding, what this is, primarily is a set of, like a template type class that just knows how to work with that API. It knows the individual operations and the parameters that need to be sent. It knows what needs to be returned, and it includes with that a set of domain objects that are bound to whatever the API is going to return back. So you don't have to deal with this yourself. You don't have to make a REST template call and then somehow create a domain object that REST template's going to bind the data to. We provide that for a handful of these. Facebook and Twitter primarily are the two that I'm really focused on. LinkedIn to a lesser degree. For historical reasons, we also support TripIt and GitHub. TripIt specifically, I'll talk about a little bit later. I've sort of shelved, hoping that somebody in the community will step up and run with it, and if nobody does, then apparently it wasn't that valuable to anybody. It was there primarily as a driver for some specific functionality that TripIt originally implemented, and now TripIt does not do that anymore. And as a consequence, it's not helping me except making my life miserable when I have to support yet another API binding. GitHub we're probably going to keep around for a while because there's actually a lot of value in providing GitHub connectivity, especially if you ever use spring.io, our website, if you ever visit it, there's a lot of Spring Social GitHub under the covers in there. And so I sort of need to support that in order to just support spring.io. But there's a lot of community projects, and I'll talk more about those here in a moment. But the one thing I do want to stress is even though the project name is named Spring Social, That's a horrible name. I wish it was not named that in hindsight. I wish it was named something else. And maybe someday I'll get to rename it. Right now it's still called social. I want to call it Spring Connect. Connect makes sense to me because that's what we're doing. So we're connecting your application with another API. But to prove the point that it's not just social, we have a handful of, and there's more than this, but there's just 3 here that I've pulled out that I might point at that Spring Social does have integration for, does have support for, at least through, if not from me, but through community projects that are very non-social in nature. First off, we have Ecobee. So Ecobee, the Spring Social Ecobee project, interestingly enough, was written by one of the guys on the Spring team, but he wrote it in no official capacity. He did it as just a fun exercise. And so don't consider it supported in any way. But in fact, he would like me to tell you about it because he would like people to pick up and kind of help him maintain and develop it. But it helps him control thermostats in his house. These little smart thermostats. And interestingly enough, these thermostats are secured with OAuth. And he can connect to these thermostats through OAuth using Spring Social. And he can get all sorts of interesting information about kind of, you know, what the temperatures are in the home currently. I think he's implemented the stuff where you can kind of see a trend of the temperatures. I don't believe he's implemented where you can actually set the thermostat through the API, but I do believe it is possible to do that. I just don't think he's done that yet. And so I wouldn't consider this a social API. I probably wouldn't want my friends changing the thermostat in my house. I have enough problem with that when my family comes to visit. I don't really want just to let the wider world do this. So that's not really a social API. Yet Spring Social is used to do this. There's another one called Wunderlist, which helps. It's a strange little app that basically is you know, we all implement to-do list applications as demos, right? Yeah, somebody's actually done it and deployed it. And so this is essentially what Wunderlist is these to-do lists and reminders and errands. And I wouldn't consider that social, I mean, unless you're sharing these to-do lists with other people. But Wunderlist, we have a Spring Social Wunderlist for doing that. And then GitHub and Bitbucket. Now, you might argue GitHub is a social network, and to some degree it is. And you can follow me, you can follow my projects. As far when it comes to coding, GitHub is referred to oftentimes as social coding because we socially code together through this repository. But if you step back a little bit, it's just a source code repository. And so GitHub has an API that's secured with OAuth. We have Spring Social GitHub for that. Same thing with Bitbucket. We have Spring Social plugin that a community member has written for working with Bitbucket. Again, I wouldn't consider those social networks, but there you go. There's also, I don't have it listed here, but Spring Social Salesforce. I really don't consider my finances, or not Salesforce, my, not finances, my sales calls and my whatever else Salesforce does. I don't use Salesforce, so I'm just guessing. But I don't consider that a social network, yet there you have it. And then one other is Quicken. There's Spring Social Intuit has gives you access to QuickBooks Online. I wouldn't consider my finances a social network kind of problem, and yet Spring Social will integrate with those. Did you have a question?
What is the criteria you decide to add APIs, right? I mean, anybody could integrate with an API pretty much. I understand social in the sense of Facebook, but things like Wunderlist, why is it unreliable?
Okay, so the question is, why can't I just go integrate with this myself? Is for any API out there? And the answer to that is, well, sure you can. The thing is, Spring Social takes away the need for you to develop the pieces of your application that deal with the OAuth Dance, and deal with the tokens you get, and deal with refreshing those tokens if they expire. You don't worry about that. You just worry about using the API. And that may become a little bit more clear when we get around to seeing some of the example code here in a minute, because you're going to be shocked at how little code I have.
My question is, what is the criteria that you use to decide whether you integrate something?
Whether you should integrate it at all? There is no criteria for me. For me, I have a very finite list of things I'm going to maintain, primarily because I want to focus on the core, not so much on the API bindings. I want the community to step forward and do the API bindings. And so in those cases, the criteria to decide whether or not you want to add that comes down to, do you need it? if your application needs it and there's not one already out there, you should do this. Because if you need it, maybe somebody else will come along and need it too. And so that's what it comes down to. In some cases, I will admit, in some of these community cases, it did come down to just geeky interest. They wanted to see if they could do it. But realistically, it comes down to, are you going to need this API? Do you want to mess with implementing the entire OAuth scenario yourself, or would you rather just focus on the connectivity and using the API? In that case, that's why you would do it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so it seems like using IDPs and also APIs, and I'm wondering why Google isn't an official one.
You're asking why Google is?
Why is it a community one as opposed to official?
Why is Google a community-led project for Spring Social as opposed to an official one? It comes down to, again, I want to focus on it comes down to two reasons, really. Initially, when I first started this project, there was no large-scale Google API. There were several individual Google APIs, but nothing major. And then we wanted to focus primarily on the core, and we needed a handful of API bindings, such as Facebook and Twitter, to kind of drive out some of the functionality. So that's why we developed those. Google came along, especially with Google+. That's when suddenly people got interested in Google, and they started providing these APIs, and the community steps forward and said, and at one time I was thinking, yeah, I would like to do Google+. I would like to do a Google API binding. But the community stepped up, the community took it, and they ran with it, and we've let them, granted, as tends to be the case in the community, sometimes those grow cobwebs, but we let them do that, and at the end of the day, again, my bandwidth is terribly limited. The other guys on the team who contribute to this, their bandwidth is terribly limited. We decided to focus more on the core and just kind of maintain a couple of API bindings and then let the community drive the rest. The thinking there is, if it's important to the community will step up and do it. If it's not important to the community, they won't. Google's a special case also in that Google has a crap ton of APIs. And they're all sort of related and then also sort of distinct from each other. It would be nice if, maybe you had individual, there's this debate that kind of, even between me and some of the other community members who've worked on it, should you have one monster Google API binding, or should you have a whole bunch of little ones? And there's benefit either way. It's a trade-off either way. And that, honestly, I want to let the community decide that. I don't want to do that myself. So our focus now is the core, and a couple of API bindings that just kind of help us drive out things there. But primarily, and I'm going to talk more to this a little bit later, I'd really like the community to do a whole lot of the work around individual APIs. All right. So here's the Spring Social project family, and here's how it's more or less structured. We have Spring Social. If you go into if you look in GitHub and see how the projects are structured, you're going to see the main Spring Social project, and within that we have 4 sub-projects. There's the core, which just provides very basic stuff. It includes an OAuth implementation, an OAuth template for both OAuth 1 and OAuth 2. And you can use those. You're free to use those directly if you want. You generally don't need to. There's a couple of cases where they come in handy, but generally you don't need to use those directly unless you want to. Then there's Spring Social Web. I'm going to go ahead and skip over to that one. Spring Social Web builds on top of the core to give you that OAuth Dance, that set of redirects that you can use to redirect to a provider and come back, and it's going to handle those for you. Essentially, it provides a handful of controllers and a handful of filters for accomplishing a certain set of tasks around connectivity. There's Spring Social Security, which aside from the fact that it has this fun little social security phrase in there, it offers an extension beyond what Spring Social Web offers when it comes to doing sign-in with. It essentially provides a fairly tight integration between Spring Security and Spring Social, so that if you are doing this sign-in with Facebook, sign-in with Twitter, it's fairly tightly integrated with Spring Security itself, as opposed to there's another similar feature that's part of web that's not tied with Spring Security. It's more agnostic to what your security layer is. So we'll talk more about those here in a bit. And then there's Spring Social Config, which was, you don't use necessarily directly, but it was born here a couple of releases ago to make it easier to configure Spring Social, easier to work with it. What happened is in the initial version of Spring Social, you had to write a lot of XML configuration in Spring just to make things work. We made that better with both an XML namespace and Java config support. And built on top of all of that, we have the provider bindings that currently we support, Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, and I put a question mark by TripIt. I might even put a question mark by LinkedIn. These are ones that we created, again, primarily to drive out features in the core. I'm kind of going to put, I think the word we wanted to put is, put it in the icebox or put it in the shelf for LinkedIn and TripIt, and hope the community will step forward and help us, but we're not going to spend a great deal of time supporting those directly. GitHub, I'm going to have to. Facebook and Twitter, I'm going to have to. But everything else, we're hoping the community will step forward. And then there's this other box. And this was updated. As far as I know, this is a complete story, but unfortunately, not everybody tells me everything. I have to learn about a few things kind of on my own. But as far as I know, this is a complete set of the community contributions to Spring Social. So we have stuff in there for all sorts of things. If you want to do photography, you got 500px, and you got Flickr, you got Instagram. If you're, we have a Foursquare, which I'm not really sure how that plays into how Foursquare keeps changing what their business model is, but we have, as I mentioned, Intuit and QuickBooks Online that's on there for the non-social type stuff. There's app.net. There's all sorts of stuff. There's things on here I've never even heard of if it wasn't for the fact that some community member stepped forward and created a API binding for it. And we'll talk more about this box in a minute. It's going to be kind of a key part of my talk toward the end here. But to kind of explain kind of the moving parts and how Spring Social works, we have this thing called ConnectController. It's just a Spring MVC controller. And what ConnectController does is it handles that OAuth Dance. And it does it kind of generically. It knows about how to do OAuth 1. It knows how to do OAuth 2. And which one it does kind of just depends on which API, which provider you're working with. Well, the ConnectController, well, pretty much this just says what I just said. If it handles different types of requests for /connect/provider ID. Now that /connect is hard-coded currently. I have in my backlog a plan to maybe change it so that's configurable, because when Spring Social first appeared, there was really no good way of making that connect part of that URL configurable. But there are ways of accomplishing that now. So I have an item in my backlog to make it where you can change that if you don't like the word connect for some reason. But it will redirect the user's browser to whatever API's authorization page, let them log in, let them authorize the application, and it's going to redirect. They'll redirect back, and ConnectController is going to handle that redirect, pull the authorization code off, assuming it's OAuth 2, pull the, I can't remember what the word is now, the verifier off if it's OAuth 1, and behind the scenes, it'll exchange that for an access token. And it does this by knowing, it knows how to do what it's going to do by looking up this connection factory. So that provider ID that's part of the URL is some key that tells it we're dealing with Twitter or we're dealing with Facebook or LinkedIn, and it's going to use that to go find a connection factory that knows how to do that dance for ConnectController. So it's going to, if for example it's Twitter, if you say /connect/Twitter, it's going to say, let's go, hey, connection factory locator, give me a connection factory for Twitter. And the connection factory itself knows how to create connections. It knows how to talk to Twitter. It knows how to exchange codes for tokens or verifiers for tokens or whatever the case may be. It just knows how to do all of this stuff, things that are specific to that provider that ConnectController can't possibly know on its own. That's what the connection factory does. It also works with another thing called a service provider to help with that too, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later too. Once it's created a connection, it's got this connection after doing this set of redirects, this dance, ConnectController hands off the token and the connection details to a connection repository. Connection repository stores it in your database, whatever the implementation of your connection repository is, it's going to store it for long-term use, because once you have that connection, you can keep using that token over and over and over again to make requests against the API until the token is either revoked or expired. Now, one thing before I go any further, I do have to stress this point because some people don't get it. The word connection evokes things like java.io, or whatever, the file connections or HTTP connections or something like, or streams or things like that. Unlike those, this is not something you have to close. I've had so many people ask me, it's amazing how many people ask me, how do you close a connection? And there is no concept of close. There's the idea of deleting a connection. Go to the repository and remove it. It's not a connection though where you open it up, you start some work and you close it when you're done, like you might do with like an input stream. It's not that kind of thing. It's representative of the relationship or the agreement that your application has made with a provider. That's all it is. It's just a representation of that, and we persist it long term somewhere in a database, let's say. And then, sure, you can delete it, but you don't have to close it when you're done. It'll be there the next time you come around. You can still use it. Once you have all this stuff and you have this connection, from that connection, you can ask for an API binding. And what this API binding is again, just a set of operations that know how to make the REST calls to the API, and it knows how to do it and make sure that the authorization header is on every single request. Now, in the case of OAuth 2, it's fairly simple. The authorization header, I can quote it to you, except for the token part, I can quote it to you. It's authorization is the header name, the value is bearer, and the value behind bearer is the token name. It's fairly simple in OAuth 2. In OAuth 1, it's a big pain in the butt. I'm not even going to try to tell you what it is. There's a whole bunch of things that goes into it. Good news is you don't have to worry about it. You just make the call. Things work. In every one of the cases, at least the ones I've implemented, and I've encouraged the community to do the same, in every one of the API bindings I've created, I've also given you an out, just in case something changes in the API. Not that Facebook or Twitter ever changed their APIs, but if they did, it gives you an out so that if I don't have a method that's going to give you what you want, I will also offer you a REST template. And it's just the same REST template that Spring offers you already. The difference, though, the small difference is it's instrumented to know that every single request you make will have that authorization header in it. So you still don't have to deal with tokens directly. You still don't have to deal with baking up an authorization header. I'll give you a REST template. You make the call you want, and I will make sure that that authorization header is there for you. So if you need to, you can get that from the API binding. So I'm going to show you an example here in a minute that looks a lot like this. But here's the general flow of the ConnectController. So the first thing you can do is do a GET request for /connect. And what the GET request for /connect is going to do is it's going to list out all the providers that the application is registered with. Essentially what this means is, what are all the providers that we have a connection factory for? So if I have a connection factory for Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, they're going to show up here, and it's going to show me the status of those connections and give me an opportunity perhaps to connect to them. Now, this ConnectController will handle this request, but it's up to you to define what that view looks like. I don't know what your application is going to look like. I don't know what styles you might want to put in there. I'm just going to provide, ConnectController is going to provide for you a model that you can use to render your view to the user. And then you can render that however you see fit. And that model is going to have things in there like a list of providers and what the connection status is, essentially. And let's just say you wanted to connect to one of these. You connect to Twitter, so you click on that. You're going to do it's going to end up with a GET request for /connect/Twitter. And it's going to show you yet another status page, but it's very focused on Twitter. And it's going to say, you haven't created any connections to Twitter yet. Would you like to connect right now? Now, again, this is just a view that you would have to provide. ConnectController gives you the model for that, but you have to provide the actual JSP or timeleaf or whatever template you like to use. You're going to have to provide that to render that to the user. That said, there is a feature in the latest versions of Spring Social. I can't off the top of my head remember the property name, but it does come up in an example later, so I'll show it to you then. There's a property you can set where if you set it to true, it will automatically give you these views. They're just not very pretty. They're Times Roman, black text, white background, very simple. You're connected, you're not connected, that kind of stuff. Extremely simple, but it's just enough to kind of get you started until you're ready to actually start building your own views. But that's an opt-in thing. You don't get that for free. You have to set this property to opt into it. So let's just say you decide you want to connect to Twitter. So you click that Connect with Twitter button, and it's going to post, it's going to redirect When you click that button, it's going to post to Connect/Twitter, which is going to trigger the ConnectController to redirect to Twitter, and what you're going to see is this authorize app. And you're going to get an opportunity to authorize the application. Now, if you're not logged into Twitter, the first thing you're going to get to see is a login page, but once you're logged in, you get a chance to click that button and say, yeah, I'll authorize this app, at which point it's going to redirect back to get/connect/Twitter/OAuth token equal whatever the request token was. That's an OAuth 1 thing. And the verifier is whatever the verifier was. Again, an OAuth 1 thing that you generally don't have to worry about, but this is something you might want to know if you want to know how this works under the covers. Well, now that it's got this verifier, it's going to exchange that behind the scenes for an access token. It's going to take that token, create a connection through the ConnectFactory. It's going to save that connection through the connection repository, and now that user who's logged into this application and that user who's logged into Twitter has now created a connection between this application and Twitter so that this application is able to see their data in Twitter. And so at this point now when I go to /connect/Twitter, where before it said you're not connected, now it's telling me more stuff, and it's telling me a little bit of general details about the user. It provides in the model just some general information, nothing specific, but just some common stuff that you might have in pretty much in any API you might want to use, such as an ID if there's a unique ID, such as their screen name. Sometimes they don't have such a notion of a screen name, but if there is one, it's there, things like that. Now there's a few other things that Spring Social also offers. I don't have pretty pictures for them, but they're at least in some ways similar to that last set of slides. There's Provider Sign-In Controller. And what Provider Sign-In Controller does is it does a lot of the same stuff that ConnectController does. But it does it, after it's done, it doesn't create a connection, and it doesn't save it through the connection repository. Instead, when it's finished with the OAuth Dance, it has information, has a token. With that token, it tries to get that general information about a user, and based on that user's ID on the API it's talking to, it'll compare that with any existing connections in the repository. And if it finds an existing connection in the repository, now it knows who the user is on that application, and it will automatically log the user in. This is not all that different if you've seen it before. This is not all that different from something called OpenID Connect. It's very similar in concept to how OpenID Connect works. In fact, that's another thing that's on my roadmap, is to actually give proper implementation of OpenID Connect in here. The difference though is the flow that we go through here, where it differs from OpenID Connect, is OpenID Connect is very much OAuth 2. Provider Sign-In Controller will work with anything, with even OAuth 1. So you can use it with Twitter, where you couldn't use OpenID Connect with Twitter because Twitter's not OAuth 2. I'm going to address that point in a minute on Twitter not being OAuth 2, because I've had a lot of questions about that before, but give me a second. Social Authentication Filter. It essentially does the same thing as Provider Sign-In Controller, except it's a filter. And more specifically, it's an implementation of Spring Security's authentication filter. Why this is important is it's just an authentication filter. Ignore the word social for a moment. It's just an authentication filter, which means you can plug it into Spring Security's authentication, Spring Security's filter chain. And it plays just like any other authentication filter in Spring Security's filter chain would play. Meaning that if you're using Spring Security in your application, and you know, as Spring developers, we kind of hope you were. If you're using Spring Security, you're going to have all the benefits of Spring Security with that. Things like Remember Me, things like, I don't know, drawing a blank right now what all cool things Spring Security does. Ask Rob Winch, he'll know. But it's just an authentication filter. So the rule here is, if you're using Spring Security in your application, you don't want to use Provider Sign-In Controller. You can, it is possible, it's just that there's going to be a slight disconnect between the two. You're not going to get the full power of Spring Security when you're using Provider Sign-In Controller. You're going to want to use Social Authentication Filter because it just naturally fits into the flow that Spring Security already offers. But if you're using some other security mechanism, you're not using Spring Security, you've rolled your own, or you've got some other open source or maybe commercial project that's implementing the security for your application, that's where you're going to want to use Provider Sign-In Controller, because it'll integrate with those other things. And you have to do a little overriding of a couple of beans to kind of tell it how to integrate with your security mechanism. But for the most part, it just knows how to do that. Now, I said real quick, I need to address that. It's a little off topic on the slide, but I said that Twitter is not OAuth 2. The truth is, it half is. And I've had people on multiple occasions come to me and say, hey, why are you still using OAuth 1 when Twitter supports OAuth 2? And the answer is, Twitter supports OAuth 1 for their user-facing APIs. They support OAuth 2 for their client credentials, when you're using client-type operations. So if you're doing a search on Twitter, you can use either OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. You're either searching on behalf of a user or you're searching on behalf of an app, so you have your choice. If you're actually wanting to tweet on behalf of somebody, you're still using OAuth 1. They don't yet offer OAuth 2 as an option there. So that's why I mentioned that. All right. There's a few other miscellaneous things that have been added over the years. Reconnect Filter. Just a filter. What Reconnect Filter knows how to do is if by chance you make a call to one of these operations in the API and it fails, and the reason it fails is because the connection is no good. Either the connection has expired, the connection has been revoked by the user. For whatever reason, that connection is no good anymore. If that happens, an exception gets thrown. And Reconnect Filter knows how to deal with those kinds of exceptions. And the way it deals with them is it walks you back through the authorization flow again and attempts to get a new connection. So you don't have to worry about it. And in fact, this is different than how OAuth 2, the spec OAuth 2 recommends you do things. OAuth 2, the spec, issues a refresh token along with an access token. And so when the access token expires, you can take that refresh token and simply exchange it, get a new access token, and keep on going. That's how the spec implements it. That's not how Facebook implements it, nor is, I believe, that's how LinkedIn implements it. I know Facebook does not. And the way Facebook implements it is they don't give you a refresh token. Instead, when your token expires, they expect you to go through the authorization flow again. They do give you the opportunity. They give you something kind of like a refresh token that anytime before your token expires, they have this notion of a short-lived token and a long-lived token. It's very confusing. They give you the option of exchanging your access token for your short-lived access token for a long-lived access token. But once your long-lived access token expires, you're out of luck. You do have to go turn around and exchange that, or turn around and go through the authorization flow again. And the reason, it took me a long time to figure out why they would do that. Why did they break the spec? And their answer I finally came up with, without asking anybody, I just thought this up after a great deal of stress, is Facebook's way of doing it is actually more secure. Because the spec gives the client an access token and a refresh token, and now the user can never has to come back to the application again, as long as that application can keep exchanging refresh tokens for new access tokens. That application has access to that user's data forever. Unless the user explicitly takes action to revoke that token, to revoke that authorization, the application can now do whatever they want forever. But with the way that Facebook does it, and the way that some others do it, if you have to go through the authorization flow again, that means the user has to be at the application in the browser. They have to at least keep using the application in order for the application to continue having access to the API. So it's slightly passive in the sense that the user doesn't necessarily have to click that authorize button again. As long as the authorization is still good, you'll just get issued a new token. And the user will never even know that that happened. But the user does still have to keep using the application. The user can't walk away from the application and the application have access to their data forever. All right, so that's what Reconnect Filter does. There's also Disconnect Filter. When a user does go to Facebook and does say, I don't want this to be around anymore, and they do revoke that authorization, Facebook has the option of sending you a callback and telling you, hey, this user's revoke the authorization. You can clean out any data you have for them if you want to. And that's what Disconnect Filter does. And it only works for Facebook currently. At the moment, I only know that of Facebook doing this. One thing I've kept in the back of my mind is if I find out about another API out there that does a similar thing, I might make this more general and support it more generally. But right now, it's Facebook only. There's a question over here somewhere.
Yeah. So with the auto refresh piece, like, does it depend on the API, or like, is it through OAuth 2 where the user would revoke that token so the app wouldn't have permanent rights to it?
Yeah, generally what happens is the user would go, so the question is it, I think I'm getting your question right. How would this get revoked? Is it through the API or is it through other means?
Do you trust the app
The spec doesn't technically support it. I mean, it does, sort of, but it doesn't speak to it directly. It's more like the user goes into Facebook or goes into Twitter and says, I don't trust this app anymore, or I just simply don't want them to have access anymore, whatever the reasons they are. They go into that, they log in, they go to their, like in Facebook, they go to the applications page, my applications page, and they find that app and they say, yeah, remove this one.
Okay, so
And
API specific.
yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things, there's a number of reasons why the token would no longer be any good. It's either expired, the authorization's been revoked explicitly by the user. There's a number of things that could go wrong. The token could just go bad. You know, there's a lot of things that could happen. And so if for any reason, the reason we can't access the API is because the token is no good, there's a very specific set of exceptions that get thrown that we understand that the token's bad. And if any of those tokens, the token bad exceptions happen, then that's where the Reconnect filter kicks in and takes over and tries to reestablish a new connection. In the case of Facebook, if they did revoke it, if they didn't revoke it, if the token expired, then what's going to happen is it's going to do the redirect. The authorization's still good. Even though the token's bad, the authorization's still good. It'll immediately redirect back. The user will never know anything happened unless they pay really close attention to the address bar while it's flickering. If they revoked it, now the authorization is bad. We redirect them back to Facebook. Now they have to authorize again. There's a real-time update controller. Facebook has this weird way of doing real-time updates. It comes down to a set of callbacks. You have to go register within your application setup. You have to go register them with a URL that they can send you real-time updates, and it's very limited on what you get back. I don't spend a lot of time talking about this yet because Facebook actually keeps changing it on me. Last I tried it, this still worked, but it was still, more recently, Facebook has given you a little bit more information than they used to. But essentially, you register this URL with Facebook and say, this is where I want to receive real-time updates. You tell them what kind of real-time updates you want to get, and they'll call you. They'll send you a post request every so often with any updates. Last I checked, they may have changed this, but last I checked, the updates you got weren't very useful on their own. They were primarily an object ID. So if a user changed some information about themselves, that's a real-time update. If they change their email address, let's say, and you were authorized to see their email address, you might get a real-time update for that user, but the update you get is not going to tell you their email changed and here's their new email. That's not what it's going to tell you. It's just going to say, hey, this user changed, go figure it out for yourself. Just know that here's the user that changed, you go figure out what changed and update your records accordingly. There's also generic OAuth 1 connection factory and generic OAuth 2 connection factory. Remember, I spoke about these connection factories earlier, and everybody has one. There's a Facebook connection factory, a Twitter connection factory, a LinkedIn connection factory, and every one of those implement either OAuth 1 connection factory or OAuth 2 connection factory. There's these generic ones. These are kind of important. I'm going to talk more about these toward the end of the talk. These are kind of important for APIs that don't exist yet, for API bindings that nobody has created yet. So if a brand new API comes up tomorrow, let's just say we bring this brand new social network called MyPeeps online tomorrow, and we want Spring Social support for MyPeeps right away. Well, you could spend the time creating all the stuff necessary to make this API work with Spring Social, but you're going to have to do a little bit of work. To get it turned up right now, you can use generic OAuth 1 or generic OAuth 2 connection factory. You configure one of these. You essentially tell it where the authorization URL is, where the token URL is. You tell it what your application's credentials are for that. You configure these things for one of these connection factories, and what it's going to do is it's going to register that as a connection factory within Spring Social. And then when it gives you, it's going to work just like it does for anybody else. The difference is when it gives you an API binding, it's going to give you a REST template. It's not going to give you some specific API binding like we give you with Facebook or Twitter. It's just going to give you a REST template, and that REST template is going to be instrumented to be able to make sure the authorization headers on every request. It's just like the worst case scenario, the simplest thing we could possibly give you if we don't know anything else about the API. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later because I have some plans for what I want to do with this going forward. And you might also want to know about, I mentioned it previously, there is OAuth 1 template and OAuth 2 template. If you want to work with OAuth directly, you don't want to deal with the ConnectController for whatever reason. Maybe you want to build some of this stuff in, but you don't want to use Spring MVC. I don't know why you would not want to do that. I mean, we're at a Spring conference, right? But maybe you don't want to use Spring MVC. You want to do it through some other means. You can work with OAuth 1 template and OAuth 2 template directly. If you've seen any of the other OAuth libraries out there, there's several of them. They offer essentially what OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 template offer. That's what they offer out of the box. We offer, on top of that, the connection. That's kind of the differentiation between Spring Social and other OAuth libraries out there. We offer what they offer, but we also offer this connection flow on top of all that. But where you might want to use these is if you're wanting to get client tokens. There is no such thing as a flow for a client token. Or password grants. If you're doing a password grant where you're given the user's credentials and you just want to exchange that for a token, there's no flow there. There's no redirect involved. The simplest thing you can do is, here's some credentials, give me a token back. And so in those cases, that's where OAuth 1, OAuth 2 template come in handy. Generally speaking, though, you probably don't want to mess with these guys, but they're there in case you want them. So let me show you a couple of quick examples. You may have seen some of these before. That's okay, we'll show them again. I spent a little time last night and I just gave up and reverted everything because it was late and I was tired and it wasn't working out my way. I was hoping to actually skin this differently so it looked more like the Spring 1 look and feel with all the blues and all that stuff. I just gave up. It wasn't worth it. But here we have Spring Social Showcase. You can go get this out of GitHub under github.com/spring-project/spring social samples. It's one of them in there. This is specifically, there's several different Spring Social Showcase examples in there. I'm going to start weeding those out and getting rid of a few of them because some of them are just old and I don't care to maintain them anymore. This is the one called Spring Social Showcase Boot. It's based on Spring Boot because, you know, that's how we do things now. So if you've ever worked with Spring Social prior, you know, to Spring Boot coming along, you know that you had to write a lot of configuration, a lot of XML configuration, and even after we added the config project under the core, you still had to write a little bit of XML, you still had to write a little bit of Java config. Well, this one, I'm going to show you the code for this one in a minute. It's going to be pretty cool. But I'll show you what it does first so you can kind of see where all the code I show you comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and just sign in here as me. Oh, that's awesome. I love it when things work in front of people. That's great. I'm not sure what just happened there. Oh, I think I know what happened. I need to refresh this page because my, yeah, that token, that little, that token that's on the page that Spring Security puts on there, it timed out. I need to actually probably deal with that a little bit better than just showing you an ugly error page. All right, so we're logged in now. Here I am. I'm logged in as Craig. I'm going to go check my connections, and you can see in the URL it's /connect, and it's showing me that status page for Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So I can either click here or I can go over here. Either one's going to take me to the same place, and I can connect with Twitter. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and just do something cool. I can do this. Let's post a tweet basically telling all my friends that I did connect with Spring Social Showcase. So I'm going to connect with Twitter. I'm going to authorize the app. It's going to redirect back, and now I'm connected to Twitter. And now I have some other things I can do. The most notable thing I can do is I can look at my timeline. And actually, I think if my guess is right, it probably failed to post that update. And the reason it failed is because I actually did this last night. And Twitter doesn't like it when you post 2 tweets in a row with the same text. So I think it failed, but it failed nice and silently. If I dig around in here, that was me. This was me tweeting. Where's the... There it is. I'm logged in as Haboom Dev, so I'm not tweeting to the world that I did this. But this is what I did last night. I've connected with Spring Social Showcase. So that's when I did this last night, that's what it posted. Had I not done it last night, it would have done it with a different date on it when I just did it. The user profile, my first name is Michael. Don't tell anybody, it's a big secret. But my Haboom Dev account has my name as Michael. So it says hello Michael Walls. It has my Twitter ID, my screen name. If it knew any of these other things, it would show them, but it doesn't have that information, so it didn't. Here's some of my friends on Twitter. I don't have too many friends on Twitter. I'm not even sure why Red Carpet Refs is a friend on Twitter. I honestly don't even know what that is, but nonetheless. This is my Haboom Dev account, so I don't have too many friends there. I also have like no followers. because nobody knows about Habuma Dev, and I don't encourage you to follow me there. There's not a lot of interesting things happen there. If you want to, cool. Maybe it'll make my next time I do this demo more interesting, but you know, you don't have to. Direct messages, well, that's not working right now because I don't have, my application doesn't have the authorization to do that. I probably should handle that a little bit more gracefully, but, and then there's various trends, some of which I clearly don't understand. But these are trending right now, and this is more of a general what's trending on Twitter right now kind of page. I always worry a little bit when I pull this up because I'm not sure what's going to be in there and what might offend someone, but not my fault. I didn't write it. This is just what's happening on Twitter. If you're offended, bring it up with Twitter. Well, yeah. Same thing with Facebook. I can go connect with Facebook. I'm not going to tell all my Facebook friends about it, but I could. And now I'm connected. I can see my profile on Facebook. I got my Facebook ID as well as my name. Now, Facebook recently, I say recently, it's been a little over a year, 2 years maybe, they started giving everybody a unique ID based on the application. So if this is my ID for Spring Social Showcase, but if you created an application and I logged into it, I would have a different ID. That ID is very unique to the application. They have this other thing called the Business Application API that lets you kind of coordinate those. If you have multiple applications under the same heading and you want to somehow get those linked together, there is an API for basically associating different business or different application-specific IDs as one user. But right now, this is just what we're seeing as my Spring Social Showcase ID. My full name, you can see my feed. I don't even know what's on my feed, so I don't think I write anything that's offensive there, but you know, I got one of those BB-8 robots, that was pretty cool. And there's this group called Nuru that occasionally sponsors some of these conferences. You should check them out. They have a great video. That's Billy Williams. He's the most hilarious person I've ever met personally. You got to check that out. There's my friends. I don't have any Facebook friends. Actually, I have plenty. I have lots. I'm not that lonely, but at least my wife is my friend on Facebook, but it doesn't show up here. And the reason I'm even showing you this is because in recent API changes that happened in Facebook, when you ask for a set of friends, you don't get everybody. You only get a list of friends who are also using that same application. That's an interesting restriction they placed on it here a while back. So even though I have like 200 or something friends on Facebook, I have 0 as far as this application is concerned because none of my friends on Facebook have used Spring Social Showcase, which is not shocking at all because my mom doesn't even have a clue what I do. So she's not going to be able to do this. She will never show up there. Of course, I have my albums. Show you my truck. So you can see the photos and everything. I'll show you the cool version of my truck while we're talking about it. So anyway, there's... You can access all this stuff that's happening in Twitter and Facebook, and I could do it with LinkedIn, but I'm not going to. These little links here, in case anybody's wondering what sim revoked is and sim expired are, there are links I put in there to simulate a token expiring or a token being revoked so I could test it without actually having to go out to the API and revoke it. I'm not going to bother showing you those right now because they're actually broken right now because of some testing I've been doing. But there's all sorts of APIs calls you can make. This only represents maybe like 2% of what you can do with each of these. But I am going to show you those. I can sign out now. Now I'm signed out of Spring Social Showcase. If I were to log in as Roy, you're going to see he doesn't have any of those connections because it's a different user. I would not like Roy to log in and be able to tweet or see my friends or whatever. That's part of the security. The connection is associated with the user who's logged in. But I could log in as Habuma, and you can see now I have all these connections. They're still there. What I can also do is, because I have created a connection previously with Twitter, I can just say sign in with Twitter. It goes to Twitter and then redirects back, and look, I'm signed in again. What it did is it figured out, oh, I did that OAuth Dance, I looked up your user information, I compared your user ID with a user ID I have on record for a connection. Based on that connection, I know who the user is, so I'll go ahead and log that user in. You can do the same thing with Facebook. It would also work with LinkedIn if I did the same thing with LinkedIn. Nice thing about Facebook is they don't actually show you that little landing page for a moment before they come back. They come back immediately. I should point this out. Some people ask, what's this? That's something Facebook does. I have no idea why they do it. It doesn't hurt anything. Don't worry yourself with it. But a lot of people ask what that is. I think my code's broke, they say. Why is Spring Social putting that in the URL? It's not. It's Facebook doing it. I don't know why they do that. All right, so I think I've shown you about everything I can show you with this, except for the LinkedIn stuff, which is at this point kind of boring because it's not much different than what you do with Facebook and Twitter. So I'm going to show you another example. Actually, I want to show you the code for this one first. This is a little exciting. Here's the Spring Social Showcase boot. There's a lot of stuff in here that's there for the sole purpose of doing things with Facebook. So the controller, once I have a connection, I have this like Facebook Friends controller that's injected. Let me see if I can get this where you can see it better. That's injected with a Facebook object. Facebook is the kind of root of the API binding. And from that Facebook object, I do things like Facebook friend operations, get friend profiles. And it puts that in the model. But at no point did I do a GET request for graph.facebook.com/ whatever my ID is / friends. I didn't do that. This is all happening under the covers. I didn't have to put the authorization header in there. I didn't have to do anything. I just call the method. I get what I want out of it. And there's most of this code in here is doing that kind of thing. So I'm not going to show you all of that. What I will show you is the configuration for this. I'll show you the security configuration, which is not terribly exciting unless this was a Spring Security talk, but it's fairly basic Spring Security configuration. Setting up some JDBC authentication so I can authenticate against an account table. I've got some stuff where I'm ignoring certain paths. I'm configuring the basic Spring Security stuff, which has nothing to do with Spring Social. But I'm showing you that just so you can see that, in fact, there is stuff here happening with regard to Spring Security. Here's just your basic boot initializer. If you've ever built a Spring Boot app and you wanted to create a WAR file out of it when you're done, that's what this does. You need one of these. I don't care if it's Spring Social or not, you're going to need one of those. So this is really just boilerplate code for the most part. And then there's the only other configuration that you have is application.java, which has its main method. It's the bootstrap class for Spring Social, but there's nothing else. Enable auto configuration, enable configuration properties. Ultimately, this is the only thing that has anything at all to do with Spring Social, is that being right there. And that's there because I'm using provider sign-in controller, and provider sign-in controller does not know what kind of security I'm using. I could use Spring Security, I could use other means, but it's simply using the HTTP session request cache from Spring Security to do its sign-in. That's it. And so I had to create one of these guys and register it as a beam, but after that I'm done. There is no Spring Social configuration anywhere in here from a Spring perspective. There is none, because Spring Boot took care of it for me. How did it take care of it for me? I added Spring Boot's social Facebook, what's the word I'm looking for here? Starter. I added the starter to my build. I added the starters for Twitter to my build. It took care of it from there. Let me show you the build. Just to kind of put a fine point on what it is I'm saying here. Those first three dependencies there are what make that work. By virtue of the fact that I have those dependencies in my build, I have auto configuration support for Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And the only other thing I needed to tell it was my credentials for those APIs. So I had to go out to Facebook, I had to go out to Twitter. I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. I can go to dev.twitter.com. I hope I'm logged. Oh, I'm logged in as Haboom Dev. I'll do it to LinkedIn. Developer. I can do it Facebook. Facebook will work. I go to Facebook. I can look at my apps. I can go to Spring Social Showcase. And you can see right here, after I registered with Facebook and answered some questions about my app, they're giving me an app ID and a secret that I can get if I were to ask them nicely. But I get this app ID, I get this app secret, and then I have to tell Spring Social about it. And the way I tell Spring Social about it is with the same way you would tell Spring Boot applications about anything. I set it through a property, either my environment variables, application.yaml, application.properties. If this was a Spring Cloud-based project, I might put it in the configuration server. But here you go. Here's my credentials for Spring Social, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Please don't write those down. Please don't take a photo of them. I've recently, up until fairly recently, I actually had those committed into GitHub. The thinking being is this is just a demo app, who cares? There's two things that go wrong when that happens. Number one is I start getting weird messages on Facebook, and I don't know how it's happening. I haven't figured it out, but the only thing I've concluded is that somehow people were using my credentials, my application credentials, to do something weird with my Facebook stuff. And number two is Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, they start getting angry with me because I've published these things publicly. So I've taken them out. If you ever download Spring Social Showcase out of GitHub and want to run it, first thing I want to do is visit this file and go add your own keys in there. But yeah, you had a question.
I saw that the API level of Facebook that we're using is 2.0, and like a month ago I had an issue when 2.4 appeared. It looked like the Spring Social stopped working, and Facebook doesn't have this fallback, so I had to reuse some old application that I had. Is there support for 2.4?
There is support for, I think the current version is, yeah, you saw 2.0, that was the version of Spring Social Facebook.
Yeah.
That's not the version of Facebook's API. I think Spring Social supports 2.3 currently.
Okay, but Facebook, if you create an application in Facebook today, they will create...
Force you into doing 2.4.
Yeah, and Spring Social...
I hate them for that, by the way. And the problem is that they're expecting that if you have an old application, they're going to let you kind of be grandfathered into that. If you have a new application, there's no reason why you can't just immediately today start using the new API. What they're not accounting for is things like Spring Social, where when they drop a new release, suddenly I have to implement that. Suddenly I have to do that. And it's really hard for me to keep up with that. So I think currently Spring Social is 2.3. It's going to end up having support for 2.4. One of the things it's on my roadmap as well, if nothing else, is to simply allow you to set the version. It'll default to whatever I thought the right one would be, but if you wanted to, you could tell it a different version. It won't change the URL patterns. It won't change the API bindings in any other way. It'll just change the URLs with the hope that it's going to work. That's the best I can do immediately. And then if you can wait a little bit, then the next version will support 2.4. Ideally, it should work. Ideally, unless they really made some huge breaking changes, just simply changing the URL will work.
I was getting the email after the user is logged in, and for some reason I tried everything and it was not.
I hate Facebook, really. I really do. I hate them for that reason. I understand their reasoning, but they're just not thinking about API bindings that would have to change like the day that this new thing's released. It's really annoying. What they'll let you do is they'll let old applications use new URLs, but they won't let new applications use old URLs. Yeah.
Has Facebook ever tried to partner up with Spring Social to try to coordinate?
Not really. We've chatted. We've spent some time talking about it. I don't think they care. I honestly don't think they care enough. We're just little compared to them. And the most that's happened is when I had a conversation with them at one time about this, I thought we were getting somewhere, and it finally just ended with them sending me an invitation to F8. And so that's really where it ended. And I wish there was more I could do about it. I've tried. I don't know. I don't know what to do about it. I wish there was more I could do, but right now it's just I have to keep playing catch up. We'll talk more about that later in a minute too. All right, so before we move on, I'm actually running a little short on time, but that's okay. Let me show you one more example. You may have seen this before, I don't know. I've shown it a few times. Everything I just showed you, even though I showed you no real Spring Social configuration in that code, that was still too much code. I can still do better than that. I can still write less code than that, thanks to Spring Boot. Now, what I'm about to show you, I'm going to preface it by saying, this is not an application you're going to go to work tomorrow and you're going to write it and you're going to show it to your boss and they're going to give you a pat on the back and a promotion. You're not going to get that kind of thing from what I'm about to show you. This is very much the Hello World app for Spring Social. This is the least amount of code I can write and make Spring Social do something interesting. That's all it amounts to. And if you've followed any of the Spring Boot team's claims over the last few years, it's always been fun for them to write code that fits in less than 140 characters so that they can tweet an application. It's been fun for them to do that. And I thought, if they're tweeting applications, here as the project lead for Spring Social, who's familiar with Twitter, I should be able to do the same kind of thing. And so what I'm about to show you exists only because I wanted to beat them at their game. I wanted to have the smallest Spring Boot application. That's the only reason it exists. Ideally, if I had some time, I'm getting really close to being able to write an application that can tweet itself. Really close, but not quite. We're still a little ways from that. But let me run it for you first. So I already have it in this directory, so I'm going to type Spring Run. It's a Twitter app. And of course, it's in Groovy using the Spring Boot CLI. There's a couple of points to be made while we're waiting for this to start up. Again, you're not going to use this application in production, what I'm about to show you. It's hardly production ready. But it does demonstrate the fact that, again, if you're building applications with Spring Boot and you want to use Spring Social, I have gone out of my way to make that as simple as I possibly can. And I have more in store that I'm planning to do to make it even simpler if you wait. Now, this is awesome. I love it when things go well during talks. What are we seeing here? Tomcat. Is Tomcat still running over here? I thought I killed it. Oh, no, guess I did not. My bad. That happens almost every time I get, oh yeah, I'm not running it there. I'm running it as a Spring Boot app. So now it should be dead. Like I said, I love it when things work well in talks. So we'll let this start up. Looks like it's going to be a little bit healthier this time. We're going to go to the browser now. Again, this is not only the smallest Spring Social app I've ever seen. This is the smallest Spring Boot app I've ever seen. I just want to show you what it does before I show you what the code looks like. So I'm going to connect to Twitter. And it says you aren't connected to Twitter yet. Click the button to connect to your Twitter account. Sure, I will. And it's going to go there. Or you want to authorize that? Sure. And it's going to come back. And it says, hello, Michael Walls. You are now connected to Twitter as Habuma Dev. It tells me that I'm connected. It tells me what my full name is. It tells me what my screen name is. So it's done something interesting. Now, how many lines of code do you think it took for me to write that? Any wild guesses? Do I hear 5? 2. You think 2? 2's good. Okay. Well, let's just see what that looks like. There we go. That's it right there. 1 line of code. I acknowledge that this is not the most expressive code I've ever written. That wasn't the point. But that works. And now, the one thing I didn't show you, I am being a little bit disingenuous here. I did not show you the application.properties file, which has these properties in it. And the reason I didn't show you that is if you want to count that, go ahead. It's 4 lines of code. So what? But if you want to count it, that's great. But I don't count it. And the reason I don't count it is because application.properties was just a convenient place to put that stuff. I could have just as easily have put it in the environment variables, and it would have also worked. And that I wouldn't consider that lines of code. I could have just as easily, if this was a Spring Cloud app, I could have just as easily put it in a centralized configuration server. And I wouldn't consider that lines of code. I just, as a convenience, I put it in application.properties. So that's why I don't count these as lines of code. Do you have a question?
Yeah. If I need to build something like a listener, so you can just find out about hashtags or mentions, that kind of stuff, it is something within...
Hang tight. I'm going to try to show you that before we get out of here.
Okay.
Something like that, yes.
Is there a show, because with Spring MVC and the whole integration is great, is there a showcase or example how you can kind of use the OAuth 1 or 2 template like for a desktop application or mobile application?
Sure. In the case of a desktop application, you'd probably want to use the password grant, in which case you definitely want to use OAuth 2 template. I don't have an example for that, but I mean, one is pretty straightforward because it's just a single method call on OAuth 2 template.
Okay, but you still need to somehow show a web view to handle the redirect or something like that?
There's no redirect in the case of a password grant. It's simply give me the credentials, I'll give you credentials, you give me a password back. There is no redirect in that case. And so for a mobile app, for a desktop app, there's no redirect involved. In fact, that's where things become tricky. On a mobile app, you can redirect, and you can redirect back into an app. We've done it. It requires a little setup, but you can do it. A desktop app, I can open up a browser, but I can't send you back into the app.
Yeah, or let's say I want to create a service or a microservice that I want to grapple to it and only return the ones that contain Java because I don't care about cats. So I want to only see this tweet, so I have to...
Yeah, in those cases, in the case of a desktop app or a mobile app, or in some other cases, that's where authorization code grant, which is what ConnectController handles best. It's not appropriate. You need to use password grant, or in the case of a client application, a client grant. Those are the things that are more appropriate. So let me, and OAuth 2 template will handle both of those. So let me move quickly because I got like very few moments left. I was actually expecting to finish early today. That never works out well for me. So integration, Spring integration in Twitter. This is a little chunk of code. This is a really simple set of code that I've written, and I'm going to show you it running here in a minute. Hopefully it's still running. It was running before I started this morning. And it's been running since the keynote on Tuesday night. Here's some code that sets up a real basic Twitter source for Spring integration. And what I'm telling it is, given this Twitter, which is the root, the base of Twitter's API binding, given this Twitter object, I want you to search, and I want you to search for things that are either Spring12GX or hashtag S2GX. That's what I want you to search for. And that's the message source. That's just a good old-fashioned Spring integration message source. And I'm not using Spring Integration's XML configuration. I'm using their Java config because I don't like to talk about XML these days. But I'm setting up this message source, and once I have this message source, I can do things like set up this integration flow where, given that tweet source, I'm going to poll every 10 seconds. Now, the reason I picked 10 seconds, 2 seconds is as small as I could reasonably do it. And the reason is, given a client credentials grant on Twitter, their rate limiting allows you to do I can't remember, I have to do the math to figure it out, but basically you can do something every 2 seconds. You can search every 2 seconds. If you try to search more frequently than that, it's going to give you a rate limited exception and you're going to get kicked out. I actually had this happen when I had 2 instances of this running, even though it was set at 2 seconds. I had 2 instances running and they were both beating up on Twitter with the same application ID. So I brought it back to 10 seconds because I figured that was a reasonable amount of time anyway. And I also figured I could run multiple instances of this without them getting in the way. I could run up to 5 without them getting in the way. And then I'm expecting only up to 10 messages per poll, and that's kind of, that's tunable. You want to get that to where it's a sweet spot, but for the purposes of my application, I set it to 10. I'm going to transform it such that I'm going to give it this expression called payload. What's going to give me is this message, but I don't care about the message itself. I care about the payload of the message. I don't care about the headers and anything else that Spring integration gives me. I want the payload. So I'm saying just transform, pull out the payload for me. Now that we have the payload, I want to take that and I'm going to give it to this thing called a tweet analyzer, which I'm not going to have enough time to show you the code for, and it really isn't pertinent to the talk. But I'm going to ask some questions about the tweet I just got. And when I get that tweet, I want to hand it off to a handler. Now, this is a slightly simplified version of the code I'm about to show you. The handler can do whatever you want the handler to do. There's some out-of-the-box Spring integration handlers. I wrote my own for the purposes of this. And now the get finally says build this integration flow. And so when I run it, I get to see things like this. And again, this has been running, there it is. This has been running since around keynote time on Tuesday night. And so it's showing that since keynote time, we've had 1,686 tweets matching Spring12GX or S2GX. And now there's 1,687. I'm using WebSockets to keep this updated if a new one comes in. And the top person tweeting, the top 10 people tweeting are on the left column. In the middle column, you have the people who are mentioned most often. It's not as surprising that Spring12GX is mentioned because it's part of the search criteria. Josh Long is number 2. That's also not surprising because he apparently gets mentioned quite some bit. He also tweets quite some bit, as you can see from the first column. And then the last one is the top hashtags. So people who are tweeting about Spring12GX, these are the ones who are most commonly tweeting about it. Here's the ones that are mentioned, and here's the hashtags that are appropriate to that. And so as you're tweeting this, I asked you earlier in the talk to just tweet about this stuff. We're still like 19 away, but if you were to suddenly start, tweeting about hashtag Spring Social, like everybody in this room did that right now, you would see Spring Social come up on this list over here. So go ahead, do it, knock yourself out. But that'd be awesome. But yeah, what's really interesting is the other night after the keynote, I had this running and I left it running. It's running on Cloud Foundry right now. I left it running. I haven't touched it since I launched it. But I was doing some stuff locally with it, just kind of tinkering around with it. And so locally, I don't have the history that the one running on Cloud Foundry has. So locally, I only see the most recent tweets. I sort of don't have the history of the older ones. And after the keynote Tuesday night, it was real interesting that on the far right-hand column, one of the top hashtags was sloth. I thought that was interesting. Nevertheless, I can show you the code, the actual code for this, but it looks a heck of a lot like it was on the previous slide I showed you. So I'm going to move on real quick because I have a much more important thing I want to talk about before we get out of here. And I don't have but like 10 minutes to do that. Let's talk about what's happening next in Spring Social. And to some degree, I want to answer that by asking you what's going to happen next. So Oliver tweeted this the other day, and I thought it was wonderful that he tweeted this. He actually didn't write it, though. He actually got it from a comment on Reddit by someone named Bad Moon Rawson. Anybody here know that person or are that person? Because they're brilliant. What they said is great. When given a choice, they prefer Spring primarily because of the community. And that's true. I mean, pretty much Spring has a fantastic community, as evidenced by the 1,000 or so people that are here this week. And the community, I feel it a lot in Spring Social. I have like 25 or more community-led projects. And that's great. And I get a lot of feedback from the community. But I'm asking you now to be a part of that. And if you're not already, be more a part of that. And here's how you can do that. The simplest thing you can possibly do is report an issue. So you can go to Jira. Now, some people can also post it to GitHub as a GitHub issue. I don't mind if you do that. Honestly, I would like to move away from Jira, but I'm sort of handcuffed to it for the time being. But feel free if you want to post something to GitHub issues, knock yourself out. The URL is what you see there. And if you're posting something about the core, if you're posting something about Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or GitHub, you put the FB or TW or whatever at the end of that. Ask all the questions you want. Post the questions on Stack Overflow. And what's even better about that is if you answered those questions. Because any time I spend answering questions is time I'm not spending doing other work, that, like maybe fixing a bug or creating a new feature. So if you get your head around how this works, I encourage you, please, as a community, help me out. I shouldn't be the only one on Stack Overflow answering all these Spring Social questions. Feel free to try to help me out and get some of these answered yourself. And thankfully, I've had a handful of people who've done a great job of doing that. I would love it if I had more. Be a part of the community. So it's one thing to submit a bug or to submit a change request or an improvement request. What's even better? Do it yourself. Talked about social coding earlier with GitHub. Fork the projects. Make the changes. Submit pull requests. I would love it if you do that. Now, here's the one thing I have to ask you to, actually two things I have to ask you to do. If you've not done so already, you have to submit this individual contributor agreement. It's the legal part of this whole thing that they make you do. I can't technically merge your pull request unless you've done that. But if you've done that, then the next thing I ask you to do is make sure you write good tests around your code. If you haven't written good tests, it's going to make it a lot harder for me to merge that pull request. A lot harder. I also encourage you, if maybe you don't have time to submit one of these changes, I encourage you to go look at some of the pull requests that are out there that have been submitted and review them for me. Try them out for me, because I can't simply hit the merge button in GitHub. I can't. I'm responsible for that code. And some people don't understand that. They say, I submitted this yesterday, why haven't you hit the merge button yet? Because I can't. I have to review it. I'm responsible for that code. I have to spend some time testing it. What would help me a ton is if the community tried some of these things out and left a comment there. Yeah, I tried this, it works. Or I looked at the code and maybe, help me out. Do some of the code review as well and tell me what may be better in that pull request. Because if the community is doing this for me, if somebody else in the community has reviewed this and said, yeah, I think this is good, I've tested it, it seems to do what they say it's going to do, then when I review it, I'm still going to spend time, I'm still responsible, but I can kind of relax a little bit about it. I can feel confident that somebody else has also given it a good look. I don't have to be so strict and focused on it. So I encourage you, as a community, help me do that, because I'll be plainly honest with you. The Spring team, we have a lot of things going on, and I do spend a lot of time on other projects as well. And so I don't always get to devote as much time to this as I'd like to. And so it'd be helpful if the community does that. And again, thankfully, we've had a great community. I'm just asking for more participation. The last thing I can ask you to do is contribute in the form of an extension. If there's some API out there that you want an extension for, contribute it. So instead of this list here, you can see your own up there. You could add your own project to the list, and the way you do that is actually fourfold. There's 4 steps to it. You create a service provider. Take a look at this. I'm not going to go over it line by line, but this is kind of what a very basic MyPeeps, if such an API existed, MyPeeps service provider would look like. Take a quick look at it, kind of remember what it looks like. Take a look at it later on when you get the slides or are viewing this on the video. Here's what you're going to need: a connection factory. Again, take a look at that. It's fairly basic stuff you're looking at. The main thing here is you're giving it this service provider and giving it an ID of MyPeeps. That way when ConnectController goes to it, you have connect/MyPeeps is the way it handles it. You have to create this API binding, which I can't show you code for that because it varies from API to API. Everybody's a little different. But you create your API binding, and then you have to create this little API adapter, which essentially is the thing that gives me the minimal amount of information about the user that's authorized the application. Things like their screen name, their email address, whatever the minimal amount of information is, create one of those. Once you've created that, you basically have the makings of an extension to Spring Social. Tell me about it. I will tweet about it to the world. Put it on GitHub, send me the URL, I'll tweet about it, I'll put it on my next set of slides, it'll be on the Spring Social homepage. You'll be famous, okay? And we'll get other people in the community to step up and try to help you maintain that. Now that's still too much work in my opinion, because if you looked at especially slides 1 and 2, that was a lot of boilerplate code. The only thing that was different are things like URLs, really, and the ID. So I've got this thing in work that's in the works. It's not finished yet. I was hoping to have it finished by the time we got here this weekend, or this week. It just didn't happen. But I have this thing in the works where ideally you're going to be able to do something like this. You're going to be able to configure in application.yaml or application.property, Spring Social providers, MyPeeps, give it an ID. Authorization URL is here, the token URL is here, and here's an API binding class that you can use. Ideally, that's where I want to go with this. So rather than go through those last 4 slides, rather than create a service provider, rather than create a connection factory, you do this, and I'm going to leverage the existing work I've already done with generic connection factories to automatically configure these for you. That's where I'm headed with this. It's just not quite ready yet. And the worst case scenario, by the way, is if you fail to, my goal is, if you fail to give me an API binding class, I'll give you a REST template as your API binding. If you tell me an API binding class, then I'll use that instead. That's what Spring will give you. Here's a few other things that are in progress. I mentioned the simpler extension model. I'm looking for even tighter Spring Boot support. Actually, that parentheses in that first bullet belongs on the second bullet. I don't know what I was doing there. But specifically, right now, it has support, auto configuration support for provider signing controller. I want to detect that you're using Spring Security and give you social authentication filter instead in that scenario. There is some talk between me and some of the other guys about getting a tighter integration with Spring Security OAuth, taking some of the stuff that's kind of duplicated between the 2 projects and kind of unifying those. So we're gonna talk about that here at some point. I mentioned earlier, I want to add some more proper OpenID Connect support. And I've started thinking a lot about, I had a number of questions about this recently, about stateless connections, especially when you have like a JavaScript client that wants to basically get these tokens but doesn't want to, or maybe even wants to share them with other applications. And so I've got JWT on my mind when I do that. So this is very fuzzy at the moment, but it is something I've been thinking about. And that's it. I'm out of slides. I'm out of content. I invite you once again to take a look at Spring Social. There's where you can find it on the spring.io website. There's a couple of other sessions mildly related to this talk as far as it goes with Spring integration. Unfortunately, they both took place yesterday, so you missed them, but the videos will be online, so I went ahead and mentioned them anyway. Other than that, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the conference, the next 2 sessions you got. Thank you.